Hi, this is an occasional series that I'm going to do called Flashback because I couldn't think of a better name. This is when I will pick up older comics that I read and enjoyed in my younger years to A, see if I still like them, if they still hold up after all this time, decades later, and also B, to present them to people who maybe are not that familiar with them, or maybe they are familiar and they're like, oh, I remember that comic. So the first installment of this is Epic Illustrated. I picked up these 4 issues recently at a con, and this was Marvel's attempt at creating a heavy metal competitor. And it's believed that the first issue was published in 1980. I remember the announcements were in late 79, so it could have been late 79, very early 80. I'd have to check. And it featured artists that you knew had done work for Marvel, and then some artists that were not associated with Marvel at the time, and later on either became um, more widely known via the independent circuit or at DC. So without further ado, I'm just gonna flip through some of these issues, and present the work. Chronological order. This was published in June 1981. This cover is by Neil Adams, and it really amazes me that I don't associate this kind of work, this kind of painted work, with Neil Adams. And I'm not knocking Neil Adams. Neil Adams is a legend, deservedly so. It's more just the style, because in the subsequent issue, Neil Adams does a story, and I'm used to Neil Adams drawing in this kind of style. Great stuff. It's a difference in style more than anything. And looking back on it, I'm like, this is a really lovely cover. So this issue features work by Mike Sains, Ken Steacy, Jim Starlin, Jean Bello, Joe Duffy, Denny O'Neil, Steve Bissette, and Rick Veitch. And this is where I first became aware of Steve Bissette and Rick Veitch through Epic, because they were regular contributors, and they would do these kind of either horror stories, or Rick Veitch would do a lot of these almost Twilight Zone kind of stories. And then years later, I started seeing the name Rick Veitch go into the superhero comics with Swamp Thing after Alan Moore left, and I started seeing his name because he was one of the artists that contributed to Alan Moore's Swamp Thing run. So it was kind of cool. It's like, oh, I know that guy. He was in Epic. I'm just going to flip through some of the work. Mike Sains is a guy whose work I always liked, this airbrush kind of work. He became famous because he started doing the first ones to do comics on a computer in the 80s. This is Bob All. It was a good story, actually. It wasn't too bad. Art's unique. And that's what I liked about it, because in 1980, I was just all superheroes. And so to see this kind of blew my mind, because I was like, oh, you can do different kinds of art. This isn't like the comics I read. This is a story called Life Hutch. This is a short story by Harlan Ellison with art by Ken Steacy. Ken Steacy is a guy whose art I found out through Epic, and I always liked his art. Just very interesting, unique style. It's black and white, but it's kind of a cool black and white. I always enjoyed it. This is Metamorphosis Odyssey. This is the Jim Starlin series that eventually segued into Dreadstar. And I forgot that Jim Starlin could actually do some really nice painting. I mean, the dialogue is kind of Marvel Comics superhero-ish, but that's his wheelhouse. But it isn't really bad. But I just remembered, like, wow, I'm not used to seeing Jim Starlin draw like this. It's very cool stuff. This is a short story by Jean Bello. Jean Bello is a person that did a lot of work for heavy metal. And one thing I will say is that this continues that story by Ellison and Steacy. And this is a thing that, I don't know why Epic did this, but you would have a story and then it would say, oh, continued on this page. They would do these breaks in between stories. And sometimes the break would be a few pages later. Sometimes it'd be like 20, 30 pages later. And I never understood why they felt, I don't know if they had to do it because of production reasons, or if they thought that it would keep you motivated to go to the back of the book. But sometimes you'll have a story, and then they'll have the second installment, and then you have the third installment. and it breaks up the story, not in a good way, in my opinion. But it's a really solid story, so you want to read it. Very, very, very interesting. You see, we just finished that piece, and now here's the other piece of that Ellison T.C. story. And it's like, why do we have to like go to 3-page breaks? Why couldn't we just have it all together? And you see this on other issues of Epic, so it has to be intentional. Okay, this is a Steve Bissette story. This is a horror story. Do great work. Just love this work. And again, I saw Steve Bissette on Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. I was like, oh, I know that Steve Bissette guy. He did work at Epic. So that was kind of cool. And this is a Rick Veitch story, but this is in color. He did a lot of work for Epic in black and white, but this is a really cool, almost like a Twilight Zone ending, but just really gorgeous color. And Rick Veitch always had these stories. And this one not as much, but they had allegories to like modern issues, and they also had like these little twist endings. Like this is Captain Lie, and he looks like Brando as Captain Bligh. Things like that, but just this beautiful painted artwork. And as a teenager, I was like, wow, man, I didn't know you could do this stuff in comics. I was so lame. This is the next issue that came out. And this was published originally quarterly and then bi-monthly. Covered by Barry Windsor Smith, who I am a huge fan of, and has an interview with Barry Windsor Smith conducted by Archie Goodwin. Archie Goodwin was the editor of this book, and I thought that was an excellent choice. He's the one guy that everybody loved working for. He had the chops. He understood what worked. Marvel had some great 2 years under him as an editor-in-chief, but he only took the job saying that, I know you got to find a permanent replacement. And that permanent replacement was Jim Shooter. This is the Neil Adams story. This also has that break where it continues towards the end, but this is Neil Adams in his earlier days. This is a story by Pepe Moreno. Pepe Moreno is a guy who did a lot of work in the 80s, I remember, and I think he did a Batman story called Digital Justice, and it was done on the computer. I don't think it's, I think you can find it really cheap. I don't think it was well received, but I liked his work in Epic. And I always wondered why, for whatever reason, he didn't last longer in American comics. This is the interview with Barry Windsor Smith, and the interview is very good. It's just when he's starting to, like, I believe, wind down, going Blimey Press, and he's just before he's getting back into comics. This is about 1980. And the real highlight is that you get to see some of this beautiful work that he did when he was at Gore Blimey. And it really is a good interview because it really paints a picture of Barry Windsor Smith as this guy who's a perfectionist and his whole process. And in some ways he has all that, he has that creator self-doubt that all creators seem to have, even though he's so freaking good. It's just kind of interesting. But it's a good read, but I just love all this work. I mean, this is just gorgeous. This is another installment of Metamorphosis Odyssey by Jim Shooter, and this is just really amazing painted work. And all this Starfield, it reminds me of a story I read that apparently Jim Starlin got the idea of doing the Starfield by getting an old whiteout. The old whiteout I don't know how it comes out now. I know it's in pens, but it used to have like this brush, and you would just dunk it in the whiteout thing, and then you would brush on the whiteout. But what he learned was he would just get the whiteout and then like flick the brush in a certain way, and the splatters would create the stars. Now, I don't know if that story's true. I read that, but I remember this, and I just thought this is really. I remember reading Jim Starlin before, and this is just really great looking work. Beautiful use of colors, and I like this a lot better than a lot of the work he started doing later on. It just seemed like it was just less time intensive. It seemed to me like he was just getting it done quickly. Story with art by John Bolton, someone that you don't associate working with Marvel. Let's see what else. This is a story by someone named Tim Conrad, and I actually remember this story because I thought it was pretty cool, and I remember that it actually is still pretty cool. This is that 1980 or so science fiction where it was before cyberpunk hit, and it was around the time before Alien, because Alien to me, and then there was a movie called Outland with Sean Connery that was sort of like High Noon in space. But before science fiction was like fantasy, spaceships and other planets and other races, it was Star Wars, and before that it was just a lot of fantasy, and it was just really cool stuff. And then around first with Alien and Outland, and then Blade Runner, Terminator, everything became like cyberpunk, and it became more like cold, and you got away from this la fantasy element to like, I don't know, it's this dystopian future. And so I miss this type of science fiction. I don't think we'll ever get back to it again, but to me, when I look at it, it's like, yeah, I remember when science fiction actually was like about science and fiction, not, hey, we're just gonna take what's going on today and just extrapolate it 100 years in the future and make it just miserable for everybody. This is a story that was written and drawn by Dean Motter. Really gorgeous art. I forget until I see this how good Dean Motter's art is. And then this is the continuation of that Neil Adams story that we started at the beginning. Very strange. Oh, this is back in the day when you could, on a comic, advertise Yukon Jack. Some Canadian booze. I think it's Canadian whiskey. That's just funny to me. This next issue was April 1984, so this is towards the end of the Epic run. This is, see now, Dreadstar has gone into his own comic, but published by Epic Comics. And here we have stories. Pepe Moreno, Danny O'Neill, Joe Duffy, Ken Stacey, Pat Ortega, Vaughn Baudet. So let's look at some stuff here. This is a story I remember that was serialized. It was a story written by Chris Claremont, drawn by John Bolden. The John Bolden work is beautiful. But Chris Claremont as a writer, I mean, he's sort of like Tom King before he was Tom King, where he's an average writer at best, but his runs are remembered when he had a really great artist. Like the X-Men runs for Chris Claremont were best remembered when he had Bill Sienkiewicz, Paul Smith, and John Byrne. Same thing with Tom King, and somehow Chris Claremont gets the all the credit for it, although those artists contributed a lot. That's just my personal opinion. So this is when they started getting more of like, hey, Chris Claremont sells a lot of comics, so we're going to put him in Epic. But I don't know if his wheelhouse is in these kinds of stories. I mean, if you ask him, he'll tell you yes, but I mean, I don't think so. This is a Pepe Moreno story. His art improved, really nice use of colors. Again, it was like, wow, I wonder why this guy just never caught on. I liked his work quite a bit. This is someone named Zoran Banjaka. So I don't know who this is or where they come from, but this is some really glorious black and white line work, this nice detail. It's really great stuff. And the thing, this is probably when I was still like barely a teenager. Just kind of blew my mind. This is The Sacred and the Profane by Dean Motter and by Ken Stacey. Ken Stacey is doing really lovely color work. I believe this was collected and published as a graphic novel a few years later. I just love this color. This is just really gorgeous. And this is something that really works on a large format magazine. If you put this in a regular size comic, it just doesn't have the same impact. This is really lovely. That's one of the reasons why I like this magazine. I just love the larger size. For me, it's just easier to read. This is art of Pat Ortega. Does this animal style art. And another story by Vaughn Baudet, which is funny because this is one of the underground comics greats. And here he's doing work for a Marvel comic. Another Vaughn Baudet story. Another one. And then this story by Lee Elias and Bill Dubé. And it's a flashback to someone's experiences in World War II and the Holocaust. It's really great black and white work. I love this lighting, or it's like, I love this lighting, this overhead lighting where there's these harsh shadows, and then the light bounces off the white hair. Really great work. Just really wonderful. Okay, here we go. And now this is when they start saying, hey, we got a lot more comic coming from Epic Comics. And I can tell this is Jim Shooter saying, hey, we're going to make more comics. So we're going to start having the Epic line. Instead of, Jim was like always trying these ideas, and he tried a lot of great ideas, but sometimes he just couldn't take his foot off the gas pedal. That's just my opinion. And this is the last issue that I have from August 1984. Bernie Wrightson, Jeff Jones, John Bolton are here. So let's see who we have. Demon and Ken Stacy, continue the Sacred and Profane. Bernie Wrightson, Daniel O'Neill, Rick Veitch. Archie Goodwin does an article. John Bolton, Tim Conrad again. And the cover is by Jeff Jones. So let's look at it. And it's funny because here, enjoy the magic of Epic Illustrated. Subscribe now. And then in a few issues later, they were just going to cancel it. But I love this stuff next issue, because the next issue is the Last Galactic story by John Byrne and Terry Austin. So basically, it's like sort of his Fantastic Four run kind of work. And you started seeing this, probably thinking, hey, what John Byrne is going to sell. The one that a reason why I want to get the next issue has the first full color Cerebus, the Art of Arc adventure. So they actually got Cerebus here in a color story, and the cover painting is by Bill Sienkiewicz. So I know I gotta get this because I love Bill Sienkiewicz. More work by Ken Stacy. It's like I said, I just love this work for some reason. I just really dig it. And then again, we have this continuing on page 92. Why break this up? It just drives me nuts. This is an article by Joe Duffy about a series called Star Blazers. Really interesting work. This is a story by Bernie Wrightson. I don't know if this is an old story that he did that got colored, or if this is a new story. I'd have to research that. But it's another great horror story by Bernie Wrightson. And one thing about Epic that's weird is that some of the pages would be like good quality of matte paper, and then later on, all of a sudden, you'd have like slick paper. But it wouldn't be all slick, and it wouldn't be all non-slick. It would always be mixed. I don't know what the rationale was that. I don't know if they got like a great deal on slick paper, so they used a portion of it. I really don't know. It's strange. Or they had extra cover stock. This is by Rick Veitch. Again, just really great stuff. Just great stuff. This is not work that I normally associate with Rick Veitch. If you see a lot of his later work. Just all this detail. Just really amazing stuff. This is by art, I think, is Laura Lakey. Stories by John Lakey. I'm not familiar with them, but it looks pretty good. Anthropomorphic characters. Not sure what's going on here. Haven't read it yet. And then Epic Images. This is a preview of artists that are going to come up now. So this is a limited series called Black Dragon by Chris Claremont and John Bolton. Again, they got, they're pushing Chris Claremont to be like the guy. Joe Duffy wrote the story, art by John Bolton. And again, this is that painted art that that I'm not as familiar with that John Bolton did. I'm familiar with the Camelot 3000 and the other pen and ink type of comics work, but not this painted work. And this, I'm not sure who did this. Oh, Tim Conrad, who I mentioned earlier. Really great black and white work. Really dark, great use of shadows. Really cool. And more Yukon Jack. So that's really it. I'm going to end up looking for these. I think I'm going to work on the set as time goes on. I can find these cheap. Like I said, these are available on eBay and at cons. And it was nice seeing magazines like this at the last con I went to, because there was a lot of great stuff being published that didn't last for whatever reason, but it was really good. And I've gone through these issues, and overall, the quality is still pretty good. I'm not reading this rolling my eyes thinking, oh my God, this is really terrible. I can't believe I like this. This is really, for me at least, interesting stuff. I'm sure there's some nostalgia to it, but as critical as I can be when it comes to comics, if it was bad, I would just say, yeah, man, this was good for like 18-year-old me back in the 80s, but this is not good for me now. So if you get a chance to look at these, read these, I would just give them a try. They have so many different people that did work on these books that I know guys like Frank Frazetta had covers here. Richard Corbin had a cover, maybe some work inside. Just a great collection of artists that you look back and you wouldn't associate them doing work for Marvel. And also, since it's magazine size and it's higher quality, a lot of these guys did work and you didn't see it in this format. Like Richard Corbin, you're starting to see a lot of his work with Dark Horse now, and this is beautiful, high quality. But back then, you really didn't see. You saw it in independent comics, saw it in black and white, you saw it in color, but you didn't really see it in this large size. That's it. Hope you enjoyed this. If you have any information about this series, please let me know. And if you have any laying around that maybe you're not too fond of, let me know as well. Anyway, thanks.